So whereas the psychological model was kind of looking at a one-on-one interpersonal level of a pretty micro moment in the grand scheme, the sending and receiving of just a few messages, the social constructionist model is going to take a much bigger view. It's going to kind of zoom out quite a bit, several frames from just two people and what they're doing to the activity of a large group of people, a culture, right? A community of speakers. And the social constructionist model, I have here the picture of a construction site because I do want you to think about the human activity of building something together, right? Social construction. But we're not talking here about buildings. What we're talking about building are collective representations of reality. So the social constructionist model makes the claim that people, using the tools of culture, build collective representations of reality, and that they use those representations, stories, myths, languages, songs, poems, novels, TV shows. They use those representations of reality to understand their lives and each other, to give meaning to their worlds. And this is something unlike the psychological model, which happens kind of in a micro moment. This is something that large groups of people are doing over long periods of time. We're talking about lots and lots of individual activity. And we kind of look at that activity from a very zoomed out perspective when we are using the social constructionist model. So here's what it looks like, or a version of it. Here you have a kind of large group of people sharing a space over a certain amount of time. And as that time goes on, the people are interacting with one another there in the middle. And as they're interacting with one another, they are actively building what we might call collective representations of reality. What are those collective representations of reality? Well, they are constructs like symbolic codes, certain words and their meanings and languages, cognitive customs, certain ways of thinking and processing information. For example, a cognitive custom might be to read from left to right and to stay on the right side of the road when you're driving. So cognitive customs are ways of making sense out of information in space. Another type of social construct would be the traditions, the shared traditions of a group of people. What are the stories that they tell? What are the rituals that they perform? What things do they celebrate? And then lastly, roles in rules. What kind of roles have they constructed for themselves to play in their society? What are the rules that govern the normal behavior of people given those roles? And so that group of people kind of interacting builds this almost like a lens around them through which they're going to view the world. So their collective communication in this model creates a shared worldview, right? They have all these different collective representations of reality that they share and exchange, and that makes up their worldview and how they understand and come to see themselves and the meaning of their lives in the world. So that's the social constructionist model there for you here. And it tries to explain how large groups of people have similar ways of looking at the world, similar behaviors, similar values, similar understandings. How is it that a culture comes to communicate with itself? So that's the social constructionist model. And this has some advantages. For example, it shows us the importance of understanding cultures from within their own worldviews, from within their own constructs. If you are imposing one culture's view on another, you're likely not understanding the meaning that's being shared between those people. So communication really has to be understood as occurring within certain cultural contexts. And ignoring those cultural contexts when trying to understand the communication would do a great disservice. Also, another advantage of the social constructionist perspective is that it shows us that it's important for members of a culture to have multiple complex and varied constructs. That the more ways a culture develops for seeing the world, the more nuance that culture is going to be able to express and communicate and talk about and see in the world. So this encourages us to have a lot of diversity in our cultural perspectives. Here's an example of some scholarship that might be done by somebody taking a social constructionist perspective on communication. They might ask a research question like, how do members of a culture work together to create gender roles and gender rules? So what is the activity that they're doing to define the different gender roles of their society? Let's say this is a society that has two primary gender roles. How do those get defined? Maybe they make movies where characters act a certain way. They write stories. They tell different stories. They dress the people in different way. They play different games when they're kids. Okay, so how is that communicated among the culture of what it means to be one gender or another? Scholars who are using social constructionism aren't looking for laws of communication as much as we were talking about in the psychological perspective. And instead, they're looking at what are the rules that people who are in this culture are following. How do they know what's acceptable behavior in this culture and what's considered abnormal behavior? How do they learn that? What are the system of rules that makes up behavior and communication within any given culture? So that's what you would be looking at and studying. There are some criticisms of social constructionism. For one, it's going to emphasize the idea of cultural relativity, that meaning is pretty relative to whatever culture you're talking about, that there's not a lot of shared meaning between cultures. So it's going to emphasize this cultural relativity, taking cultures within their own terms, and it's going to, at the same time, kind of de-emphasize the existence of human universals. So it's going to say that humans live in different cultural worlds from one another. Another criticism is that it puts social cooperation, the activity that we do to belong to our culture, and it really looks at kind of collective activity as above individual choice. It doesn't really matter what you do in your life. The meaning of a man or a woman is determined by your culture. So it's going to emphasize social constructions, which doesn't leave us with a lot of choice when we have to deal with those constructs. Also, it's going to ignore the role of power in how constructs get constructed and which constructs get celebrated in value. So do people with a lot of resources get to determine what stories get told? Social constructionism is just going to talk about how these stories help us make sense out of the world. They're not going to really question whose stories they are and who do they benefit. That's going to come in a different perspective that we'll talk about later, the critical perspective. So that is the social constructionist model of communication. In the next video, we're going to look at the pragmatic model.